on today's Story Beat.
I knew that Mr. Hitchcock was a real prankster who liked to throw people off their game. And the secretary, the assistant, asked me to sit in a specific chair. Okay, so I did. And at one point, the door opened and there was Mr. Hitchcock sitting in a sort of a barber chair. It was right out of Sweeney Todd with a long, whatever you call those things, like bib, with his neck back, his chin trying to face the ceiling, and the barber had a straight razor over his neck. And then the door closed. Just enough time for me to see this, right? Well, I think another person might have found that threatening or frightening. I thought it was hilarious. And I just started roaring with laughter because it had been stage managed for me. And I thought, what an ego trip that is.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on Story Beat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, author, screenwriter, and journalist Stephen Rebello, majored in literature and psychology, ultimately earning a master's degree. Subsequently, he became a clinical social worker at a Harvard-affiliated teaching hospital in Boston. But it was during a vacation in Los Angeles that Stephen secured an in-person interview with legendary director Alfred Hitchcock. To Stephen, the interview seemed like a natural progression of the telephone calls he'd had with Mr. Hitchcock while growing up. The interview, which turned out to be Hitchcock's last before his 1980 death, was published originally in Boston's The Real paper and subsequently syndicated worldwide. That led Stephen to writing for magazines like American Film, Cinefantastique, Cosmopolitan, GQ, Movieline, where he was editor-at-large, Playboy, where he was contributing editor, the Saturday Review, and others. Stephen's book, Real Art, Great Posters from the Golden Age of the Silver Screen, has been honored as one of the best ever written about Hollywood. His second book, Alfred Hitchcock and the Making of Psycho, has been translated into 8 languages and adapted for the big screen as Hitchcock, starring Anthony Hopkins, Helen Mirren, and Scarlett Johansson, for which Stephen did several screenplay rewrites. He's written 3 making-of books for Disney Animation, worked on story and screenplay development for various Disney animated projects, and developed for ABC Disney a live-action musical version of the animated classic Sleeping Beauty. Stephen's critically acclaimed 2020 bestseller, Dolls, 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 Deep Inside Valley of the Dolls, has been optioned for development for the screen. So, for all those reasons and many more, it's my distinct privilege to welcome the author, screenwriter, and journalist Stephen Rebello to StoryBeat today. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, the privilege and pleasure is truly mine. So let's go back in time. You somehow had conversations with Alfred Hitchcock when you were a child. First of all, how did you get interested in movies and writing and so on? But how in the world did you get to Alfred Hitchcock as a kid?
I grew up in southern New England, and I had no sense of geography. I had no sense of a cat not being able to look at a king. I always had the sense that these people that who made movies, who appeared on television, were somehow accessible to me. And I cannot for the life of me explain where that comes from. There's no one in my family was or is particularly interested in films or Hollywood, but I always was. And I was kind of a sick kid for a number of years, and I became a very imaginative stay-at-home kind of kid for a while.
Developed your own world, yes?
Yeah, I definitely developed my own world, and it was fed by a very rich imagination. I read a lot. I read every Dickens. I read every Robert Louis Stevenson. I read the Brontes. All of those people were really interesting to me as a very young kid. And
Sure.
and obviously the movies that I always gravitated to, that I went to as a boy and saw on television, were always the ones I look back on it now, where it was very much the viewpoint of the outsider, the little kid who couldn't quite fit in, whether it was To Kill a Mockingbird or Curse of the Cat People, or the kinds of films I'm talking about.
I do.
And I was always fascinated by, for lack of a better word, horror and suspense films, where there were always people who looked like they were a certain thing, but they were actually, quite different underneath. As a kid, as I got healthier, I grew robust really quickly, and I did some modeling as a kid. I was a singer as a kid, and so I came out of that sort of shell that I was in. But there's always this, residual of shyness and otherness to me, I suppose. And so at any rate, I was always attracted to stories about, and books and novels and short stories and television things about people who were slightly out of step,
Right.
who are just not part of the general conversation. I identified with monsters and creatures created in a test tube. So so that, how could I not be attracted to Hitchcock, whose work my parents introduced me to?
I think he's maybe one of, if not the greatest director we've ever had.
I'm not going to argue with you. There were things about his films that spoke to me, and he was, even as a child. I think the first film I remember seeing of his, was The Men Who Knew Too Much, the remake with James Stewart and Doris Day. And my parents took me to the drive-in, the Somerset Drive-In. I grew up in southeastern Massachusetts, as I said, and my dad was a tall, gangly, sort of stammering guy who I thought looked like James Stewart, and so did a lot of other people. My mother was a vivacious, beautiful and charming blonde, and there was my Doris Day. So when I saw, and she sang really well as well. And she was a beautiful, wonderful presence. Anyway, so when I saw this movie, and there was this, cute little precocious, bratty boy who knew too much, or thought he knew too much and interfered too much, and gets kidnapped for his pains. So that's really, those are so many touchstones for me, that I was riveted by this film. That I guess it was, by then it was a reissue, but I didn't know from reissues. It was, to me, a brand new movie. Or I didn't even see them as movies. They were brand new life experiences to me, as reading books. Reading books. So anyway, so I saw this, narrative that felt unlike any movie I'd ever seen, because of Hitchcock's tracking shots, because of his identification techniques that make you walk with those characters or see what those characters see. And it's a child's terror, I think, when you have loving parents, especially to think you might be separated from them. Anyway, so that was my entry movie, my entry drug to the world of Hitchcock. And so, my parents worked in factories, and they weren't part of Hollywood at all, but they certainly knew that I had dropped from some planet that they weren't sure of. But I was loved and totally supported in in my artistic pursuits, and I was a storyteller. I was able to go to movies when kids in the neighborhood could not. So I would, after the movie, sit up on a big rock in a field with my friends and tell them what they'd missed, except I rewrite the movie. I thought the movie should do this.
Oh, wow.
And so it became my movie, or Jacques Tourneur's or William Castle's or whomever's movie, filtered through Stephen Rebello. It wasn't.
But how did you get to Hitchcock?
Well, I got to Hitchcock.
Nobody can get to Hitchcock.
I'm not sure. The thing is, I used to collect stills of Hitchcock movies, and I got really into him. And one day I decided that I was going to call him up at Universal. from Somerset, Massachusetts, because why not?
How old were you?
Probably the first time I was maybe 11.
11 years old, and
I
you
know
thought
my
you'd pick
voice-
up the
I had-
pick up the phone and call Universal Studios.
Because
Why not?
you'd call information and they'd give you the number.
Sure.
And so I asked to be put through to Mr. Alfred's office because I had a few things that he needed to know. I thought, and here's what I think happened, in retrospect. I think he had a very new push button phone kind of system.
Right.
I don't think people in the office quite knew how to work it. And so here I am, and Mr. Hitchcock, I assume, saw this flashing light and pushed a button, and there I was. And
in other words, he answered the phone. There wasn't a secretary.
yes. I mean, I asked for Alfred Hitchcock, and he picked up the phone.
That's hilarious.
And so he was, at the time, I guess he had, well, I don't guess, it had been announced after Psycho that he was going to do a movie called Marnie, like right after Psycho. So in 1961 or 2, he decided that he was going to buy this book, Marnie. So of course I got my parents to order it from a local bookstore, read the book, and I told him it was a terrible mistake to do this movie. And here's why. Because, I mean, the amount of chutzpah this takes. But he listened. He made the movie later, but he was genuinely interested in what I had to say.
That's amazing.
And he thought I was, very bright. And he told me that, he said, you understand the mechanics of storytelling. And now I hear that and think, what a remarkable thing for someone to tell a child.
Well, that's amazing that he, of all people, told you that. But yes, to tell a child that you understand the mechanics of storytelling, that's fantastic.
It was, and it was incredibly empowering. I mean, a week later, I'm in school and I'm showing, you have a show and tell, and I'm showing my stills of Hitchcock movies. And kids were really fascinated. They'd never seen this side of me. Most of them hadn't. And suddenly I got really popular. And so I felt like I needed to call Mr. Hitchcock back. There were things that we didn't get to talk about. Well, see, but the next time he took the phone call. That's what separates the crazy young fan from, this young guy's got something to say. I'll listen. And so we had several lovely conversations. And then years later, he made a picture called Torn Curtain with Paul Newman and Julie Andrews, and it was going to world premiere in Boston at 10 o'clock in the morning. And so I didn't drive then. I was, I don't know what it was. I was too young or something. But a friend of mine could drive, and we drove to Boston, and Mr. Hitchcock was there, and it was another world. I mean, it's truly another world. There was no police or any kind of security that one could see. There he was in the lobby, and he was willing to sign autographs. And I, of course, marched right up to him, introduced myself. He remembered who I was. He signed my autograph and did his famous silhouette, which he did with no one else. And it just began sort of a lifelong association with Hitchcock that sort of blossomed years later when Ernest Lehman, one of his big screenwriters, took me under his wing and made me his protege.
Wow.
And so it was kind of I believe, a meant to be situation. And that world doesn't exist anymore. I mean, imagine a kid calling Steven Spielberg or.
It's unimaginable. It just doesn't happen. It's completely unusual. They're so well guarded by so many layers of people in front of them that.
Well, that's right. But the truth is, Steve, he was too. But because of that quirk, of a new telephone system that I believe they hadn't quite mastered, I broke through, and I showed up. I had something of value to him. And
once you started talking, he realized you weren't just some goofy kid. You were actually someone with something to say, and so he listened to you.
Yeah, thank you. And the thing is, I'd studied his work, and I could see that he was even as a child. I mean, I could see this is a real artist. I mean, this isn't. I mean, this is somebody whose work you can approach as, I want to go to the movies and be entertained, and that's completely fine. But there were so many. I've just felt there were so many other layers of things that he was doing, and by the time I saw Strangers on a Train, my mind was blown.
Sure.
I just thought that this guy he's in a class by himself.
So all right, I want to come back to Hitchcock, but I want to start with, the process that gets you there in the first place.
Sure.
And so clearly that was the beginning of your relationship with him on two levels, one as a fan and another as a personal someone he talked to. But when did you start to write about this kind of material? Were you writing about it as a kid as well?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, first of all, it started with me rewriting movies after I saw them and telling them to other people. So, once that genie was let out of the bottle, I began to write film reviews for the it was first a junior high and then a high school newspaper, and then became the co-editor of the paper. And I wrote a good deal of that stuff.
Did you feel like you were a good writer then, or did you feel like you needed better training?
Oh, I thought I was quite terrible, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, I needed training, and I was very lucky because there were several. I got really popular, and I was, sort of cute, and I sang on the radio, so girls wanted to know me, and and guys hated me, right? Hated me because their girlfriends heard me on the radio, and you know what I'm saying. So, but then
you were a bit of a star.
Yeah, a little bit, but I was also a kid, and I was modeling, and it really went to my head. And I think because I had a sort of sheltered childhood as a sickly kind of kid, having that kind of small town fame went to my head in a way that I was silly about it. But I was so lucky, Steve, because a couple of my teachers sort of took me aside and said, you're better than this. And here's how we know, or here's how I know. There was a wonderful teacher named Mrs. Tripp and another named Mrs. Turcott. I guess T's are important to me, but both of those women sat me down and said, "You're a really good writer. You don't just." I was flippant. I said, "Oh yeah, I think I have a flair for fiction. I thought the alliteration was funny or something." And Mrs. Turcott sat me down and she said, "You're a bit of a peacock. And you're acting in a really superficial way." She was great. I mean, she just shook me by the shoulders verbally.
And many people need that because you get a bit of a sense of yourself that's maybe a little out of proportion.
Right. Because I think it's not an excuse, but I think because I had felt so less than as a sick kid, and I couldn't compete with the athletes in school.
So, all right. So you finally go off to college and you study literature and psychology.
Yeah.
And how does that then lead you to being a journalist?
Well, I couldn't decide, and I couldn't decide which of those career paths I wanted to follow. And I felt that a good writer had to be a good psychologist, had to know about people, had to observe people, had to understand people. And I've always been an observer. When I was in college, I used to sit. I remember this very clearly, sitting in waiting for next class and drawing people, not because I was interested in being that kind of a visual artist, but because I found that I would draw these people in a way that at least to me indicated what their pain was or what their insecurity was, because I could connect to it. I empathized with it. So there was no feeling of me being here up there and they being down there. I felt very much empathy.
Straight through observation alone.
Absolutely. And also I would listen. I was an eavesdropper. I knew I had learned, doing some acting, and had learned as a singer, I'd learned how to make an entrance and how to get people to notice me. And I also learned how to turn the switch off so that no one would notice me.
Right.
Ever. And so I would be able, and I was very interested in listening to conversations, not in a voyeuristic way, but because I wanted to hear what was wrong with a person. I wanted to hear where they hurt.
This is before college, before you were studying that, or after?
Oh, way before.
Way before.
Way before, but it became heightened during, because I could see that, I could see that I had gifts for empathy. I really had diagnostic. I mean, I could see this, very, very clearly right away. So hence the double major. Also, being a bit of a show off, and being insecure at the same time, I felt like I wanted to double major because I wanted to see if I could.
You were trying to prove something.
Absolutely, always. Well, look, I was a blue collar kid from people who hadn't been educated, but who were, wonderful and warm. And I remember really clearly at one point being asked to go to this happens a lot. Back in the days when there were blackboards, some student would be asked to go and erase the blackboard. And I thought that was a coup or something, because I got to show off in front of my friends. But anyway, so I was erasing the blackboard, and I heard two of my teachers, they were talking about the people in the class, saying, and they said about me, "What about this one?" and the male teacher, male teacher said, "He's good in spots, but he's inconsistent." And
wow,
that was such an FU to me. And then the teacher said, "Well, his parents could never afford college, so what is he going to do?" And that became such a spur to me that became like, someone digging the stirrups in my flank.
You became seriously incentivized by a dig at you.
Yes, I did. And the nonsense, the show-offness, all of that stopped like that day. And I applied and then I got straight A's, and then I went to went to college, and I thought I was going to be a teacher, and I got out of the teaching college first year. I mean, I did well enough, but then I switched to University of Massachusetts, and I got, and that's when I double majored, and I did really well in languages and all of that stuff. And I was writing all the time. I was writing plays
about Hollywood.
No, less at that time.
You were actually writing fictional stuff.
Yes, I started writing to sell things. I started because like, who makes money writing movie reviews?
The same question could be asked about plays. Who makes money writing plays?
Well, but in my view, I mean, people like Moss Hart and William Inge and the Angry Young Men of the 60s. Those people were to me, Tennessee Williams, they were gods. Like Lily, I remember reading in order everything that Lillian Hellman wrote. I didn't know about that money. All I thought was these people were extraordinary, and I want to be that. And so I started writing plays. Some were done in school, some were done amateur kind of theatrical stuff. But I was like Sheila Delaney, like people like Sheila Delaney and A Taste of Honey and John Osborne, Look Back in Anger. These things were, because they were all about working class people with chips on their shoulders.
So you related to it.
Absolutely. I connected really deeply. And that's what I thought my path was. But then my father was a Depression era guy, and he really wanted me to make sure that I had a way to make a living. And I thought that psychology was a way to make a living, and I wanted to help people. I wanted to help people help themselves. And so I became a therapist. I went to grad school. I did really well. I lived in Boston. I had an apartment in the Back Bay. I had a private practice. I worked at this Harvard teaching hospital. I became, a supervisor pretty young age, and I loved it. I mean, I really loved it. And then one day, my supervisor, oh my gosh, her last name also was T. Isn't that weird? It's the first time I've made this connection. Honestly, she began with the T. She said, "You're." I mean, what we would do when we were, dealing with people who had problems that were manifesting in the hospital, or I was seeing them as private clients after the hospital. We'd write reports, and we'd write what we could remember, almost as a Q&A of a therapy session.
Right.
And she made the observation, and then it happened again with a supervisor in grad school who said, "These are plays." They never said, "You're making this up," because I didn't. They were very factual. But the way I asked questions and the way I presented them, I guess, was dramatic, because I always cut out the stuff. I mean, they were always taped. They were always recorded. So, that backdrop existed and that backup existed.
It sounds like you elicited great responses too.
I'm immodest enough to say that I love people so much and I care so much about them that I was able to dig deep quickly in a way that was not viewed as threatening, but was viewed as, caring and loving. And so those responses, in other words, I would get through what other therapists would spend a year on. I would get through it in a month. And so I loved that. I miss it, even still.
So I'm always fascinated by people that have one training but wind up doing something else for whatever reason. It doesn't matter what the reason is, but you wind up doing something else. So here you have this grand training, you have an advanced degree, you know what you're doing in that business, you've actually worked at it, but you wind up writing about Hollywood in varying ways. And my question is, do you use that experience and your education in the work that you do today, in the writing about various subjects, Hollywood subjects? How does that, your early training, impact what you do today?
Directly, and every moment. What happened was I had been a therapist for almost a decade, and I started my doctorate at Harvard, and I thought, I'm really tracking myself now. I mean, this is going to be my life choice, and I was working at it, and then suddenly two larks. One is they were casting a touring company of Godspell, and a friend bet me that I wouldn't go audition, and I did, and I worked up 2 songs, and I got a 4th callback, and I thought, they're going to offer me this, and I'm going to have to make a decision. Am I really going to drop out of grad school to do this? And I was always, if I'm not going to be Fred Astaire, I'm certainly not going to be Fred Astaire at this age. I was not going to be a chorus boy. I wouldn't do that. So believe it or not, I blew that off. And then, I fell madly in love, really, for the first time in my life. Went for the second time to California to pursue that love affair, and I just happened to be at a break. I was able to take a work break from my job in Boston and as therapist and at the hospital, and also in my private practice, and I had a semester break from Harvard, and so I came out to California. I'm not a good vacationer. I was having a great time, but I'm not a good vacationer. And so my partner to be said, wow, you're really restless. It looks like you want to do something while you're out here. And I said, yeah, I love interviewing people, and I'm really good at it, and I'm good as a therapist, but I'd like to interview a celebrity. And well, who would it be? And I said, well, I think it should be Alfred Hitchcock.
Just like that.
Just like that.
But you already had an in.
I not only had an in, But I said that out loud, and the response was, here's his phone number.
What?
Yeah. How do you know his phone number? Well, the answer came, I have a really good friend who works for Cary Grant. There's a name. Cary can't remember numbers, and why should he have to? So the friend had to be kind of a, walking smartphone long before there were smartphones.
Exactly.
And so there was the phone number at Universal. And I said, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So I called Herb Steinberg, who was fielding, interviews for Mr. Hitchcock. And he said, I really doubt this is going to happen. Hitch is old and he's ill. And anyway, he told him who I was. And 3 days later, there I am on the lot.
He remembered you.
He remembered me, and so there I was in Mr. Alfred Hitchcock's office, clapping eyes on him yet again. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences, like a peak experience of my lifetime. I was still a kid, but older. I knew much more. He was a giant in the throes of illness and losing his mojo. But we had a beautiful conversation. I was, the way they had set it up, I was put in an outer office, like a beautiful outer office, very British, hunting prints on the wall, and beautiful Hitchcock chairs. No, I'm not joking. Just lovely, genteel, with a secretary making English tea, and it was early-ish in the morning. He just come in. And she said, well, Mr. Hitchcock is with Tony, his barber or driver, I can't remember which, but he was definitely with his barber because I'll tell you why in a second. So anyway, they put me in this chair, and I knew that Mr. Hitchcock was a real prankster who liked to throw people off their game. And the secretary, the assistant, asked me to sit in a specific chair. Okay, so I did. And at one point, the door opened, and there was Mr. Hitchcock sitting in a sort of a barber chair, it was right out of Sweeney Todd with a long, whatever you call those things, like bib, with his neck back, like in his chin, trying to face the ceiling, and the barber had a straight razor over his neck. And then the door closed. Just enough time for me to see this, right? Well, I think another person might have found that threatening or frightening. I thought it was hilarious. And I just started roaring with laughter because it had been stage managed for me. And I thought, what an ego trip that is. He cared enough to make sure he had a beautiful entrance. I had something to write about right away, right? And, and 5 minutes later, I'm in the office, and he was just a little puck. I mean, he was witty and playful and sardonic, and anyway, he was delightful. And so there we were again.
There you were again, face to face with the man.
So how does that lead anywhere? It led to my selling the interview. It was going to be in the Harvard Crimson, and they were giving me nonsense, and I went, who needs that? Although my allegiance was certainly to them. But anyway, I sold it to the Real paper, which was then a very popular underground sort of paper read by all the people that I thought mattered. The people who really loved movies, who go to the best.
And that article springboarded you into everything else.
It did because it appeared in that newspaper, but it got syndicated worldwide because it was the last interview Mr. Hitchcock gave. Mm-hmm. And it immediately gave me cred as a writer. And so magazines, you remember magazines, right?
I do remember magazines. I'm that old.
There were lots of them then, and a few of them came after me. You mentioned some of them earlier. And I started writing for them, and I left Harvard. I was having such a wonderful time, and I thought, I'll do this for a couple of years, and then maybe I'll go back to therapy, but it was a fulfillment of something that I loved as a kid, and it made me feel like a kid again. And
I have a feeling that you have practiced therapy through your books, whether you realize it or not, and that you've analyzed things in a way that people can see your analysis of it. And that in and of itself is a kind of therapy, whether it's on a personal level or whether you're communicating through the act of writing. At some point you decide, I'm jumping way ahead now, at some point you decide to write an in-depth look at Psycho. Why pick that movie over the entire Hitchcock canon? I know why I might pick it, but why did you pick it?
That's the question that everyone asked, editors and publishers. The answer is that I've always had sort of
well, you are a psychologist and it's called Psycho.
Yeah, that's part of it. Absolutely, that's part of it. I'm sure that as a kid seeing the movie for the first time, I identified with Norman's stammering because my father did that. I identified with it because I stammered, stuttered as a child for a while. His shyness, his reclusivity. Also, I just felt from a commercial, this is awful to say, but from a commercial viewpoint, I just thought, this is a movie that most people know.
That's for sure.
And I felt at the time it was a movie that it's hard to remember this, but it's true that most people have that response that you do. And I know why you asked the question, and I'm glad you did, or put it in the way you did. Because even with the Hitchcock's associates, they would say, oh, but why aren't you doing North by Northwest or Rear Window? It was the little TV movie that was considered disreputable, unpleasant. One of I won't mention the person's name, but one of the people involved in the film said, well, why do you want to do write about an unpleasant movie about a queer? And I was stunned by that because
what a weird question to ask.
It's a really weird thing to say. And first of all, Norman Bates isn't queer. I understand.
He's got many problems, but I never thought of it that way.
Homosexuality isn't one of them. And I thought, God, this person made the movie.
In fact, he's a peeping Tom on a woman.
Thank you. And still doesn't understand what movie they've made. And I thought, this is interesting. See, that's the kind of thing where the two teachers are talking about me, and I go, oh, really? And so that comment was again the kind of thing that I go, no, I have to write this book because there's so much misunderstanding, misrepresentation, and I didn't want to do a thematic. I didn't want to do a thematic, sort of treatise on how the movie worked or why the movie worked. I wanted to do a nuts and bolts as much as I could. This is what it's like to be on a soundstage with Alfred Hitchcock at this particular time in his life. He felt hemmed in by the kinds of movies he had made. He felt hemmed in by the kinds of budgets he'd been given. And and people in that movie, making that movie, including Hitchcock, they were going for broke. They were sticking their necks out.
Well, he was making a movie unusually quickly. As you say, a TV movie. He was making it like it was a television show.
Sure.
In black and white.
Yes.
With a very unusual structure to the plot, truly unusual. And he was making something that was extraordinarily graphic for its day. And he knew he was pushing on a really big button for the public.
Exactly. Very well put. And he also knew what a risk it was that he was sort of threatening to shake up everything that people thought about Hitchcock and the way he made movies and the way he saw the world. There'd be no Technicolor, there'd be no Grace Kelly, there'd be no beautiful romance and no.
And he didn't really make horror movies. He made suspense movies. He made almost detective stories or mysteries, but this was a horror movie.
Yeah. And he knew it, and he kept asking his wonderful wife and collaborator, Alma, do you think I'm going too far? Am I going too far? And you know, I mean, he lost professional associates, people who'd been with him for decades, because of that movie, because they thought, yeah, he was going too far. So, you know, I've just felt that it was this was going to be an interesting movie to look at and look at. I mean, when was that book published? Oh, 1990, I think, and it's still going.
It's still going. So how much research did you do? How long did it take you to assemble the material in order to put the book together?
Quite a lot. Well, I mean, a lot of the research was my own head. I mean, what were the feelings engendered by my seeing the movie, and what did I remember about the first time I saw the movie? And then, you know, I just started going to libraries, and I went to New York and went to the Billy Rose Library and a bunch of places. I went to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Library, the Margaret Herrick Library.
Right.
As things happen in my life, Mr. Hitchcock's family, he passed away by then, Mr. Hitchcock's family donated the Hitchcock papers to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences.
So there they were.
Library. And then they contacted me and said, guess what we have? So I was the first person to look at those files you know, papers that Hitchcock had touched, you know.
And once again, you were connected to Hitchcock almost without effort.
Almost completely without effort. It's almost telepathic. It's almost intuitive.
Interesting.
And so there I am again. And I'm telling you, Steve, looking at those papers, I could, well, you know, I'm an imaginative person, but I could smell the soundstage. I mean, it was that I could hear what the sound of that dialogue was like on the soundstage, not the way you hear it in a movie theater. I could hear Janet Leigh, who was lovely, just a lovely person, and I spent a lot of time with her. But it became, I mean, looking at those papers, and I did it chronologically as best I could. It was as if I was back in that time. You know, I could see what time John Gavin had to report for the set the next day. It became very, very immediate to me. So I loved writing that book, and it was a great pleasure. I wish I could rewrite it now. I wish I had access to those people.
Well, everybody that writes something thinks later on it would be better if they rewrote it some other way.
Yeah, but it really would be. So you know, but it was wonderful just, you know, talking, you know, searching out these people and driving out to places like Temecula and the desert and some of the people who had made Psycho with Mr. Hitchcock and had worked obviously a lot on his television shows. And so they were this beautiful resource of stories, tales, talking about his foibles, little things that he would do on the set. So it became very immediate. Midway in writing the book, I said, Rebello, you're doing this all wrong. You should write it the way, you should write it like a movie.
Mm-hmm.
But it was too late to do that. And I really didn't feel I had the skill to do that. And so I finished the book. Lo and behold, you know, the book, just as real art, the book on movie posters, it got reviewed by the New York Times. In fact, it was on the front page of the New York Times book review. And, you know, it was a small publishing house. It was the only, it was the only publishing house that said yes. Everyone else turned me down. They liked me. They liked my ideas. But how about coming back to us with Rear Window? So anyway, so this maverick, wonderful guy, took a flyer with the book, died of a heart attack before the book came out. It was a shame because he was legendary in New York as as an agent, as a publisher.
Who was this?
His name was Red Demner. I just love that name. I'm going to use it sometime.
Red Demner.
He was just a larger than life guy who flew by the seat of his pants and just thought I was great.
He operated out of his guts, like the way the great old time movie studio moguls operated.
You're so smart to say that. And he got immediately that I wanted to tell the story of a bunch of people flying by the seat of their pants, going like, oh yeah, this could wreck my reputation.
So I'm curious, did you have one or more eureka moments when you were in researching the book where you went, wow, I didn't realize that, and here's a big eureka moment?
Yeah, there were a couple. I guess the very first one, Steve, was when I realized that Hitchcock was so unhappy with his crew. He realized that at least from his perception, they were a TV crew, and he was asking them to do movie things, like create a camera mechanism that would follow Martin Balsam up the stairs as Detective.
And what a brilliant moment! What a seminal movie moment!
Yeah. So I got these wonderful stories about because it was all Mr. Hitchcock talking about, well, we'll do an aerial balloon. I mean, he just spitballing these kind of almost Rube Goldberg kind of contraptions. But again, so there was that. There was, the whole business of how delicate, he was just lovely and delicate about Anthony Perkins and his, how he perceived Perkins' sexuality, and how he didn't want to have him, he wanted to spare him the embarrassment of dressing in women's clothes as much as he could, because he felt it wouldn't be nice. It wouldn't be nice to Tony, and he loved Anthony Perkins. Just, they had a wonderful relationship. I was quite shocked by how disappointed he was in Janet Leigh the first couple of weeks. And I mean, he said something like, I think I've hired a limited actress with, a beautiful body. And he had to sit down and tell her that the charm offensive that he felt that she was launching as Marion was not going to get her the kind of response from the audience that he thought she was after, or more to the point, that he wanted. He said, all that charm stuff that you've learned in comedies, stop it. Stop smiling, stop blinking your eyes, stop showing your dimple. I mean, he just laid into her. To her credit, she got it immediately.
Well, she got it for sure.
The next morning, that woman that showed up for work was Marion Crane. You hear all the time, and you hear from actors who truly should know better, that Hitchcock wasn't much of an actor's director. Nonsense. I mean, if Janet Leigh is driving in a car, and it was Hitchcock who was telling her what she's thinking, what she's feeling. Oh, watch out, there's your boss. And so Janet Leigh gives a brilliant performance, and the play of emotion on her face, let me say, is all Janet Leigh. But it's Alfred Hitchcock off screen directing her as a director does, giving her what she needed.
Most great directors are great psychologists.
Yeah.
Even with no training, that's what they do, is they are able to look at each individual performer and figure out where they are able to mold and manipulate them.
Absolutely. And he was superb at that.
Clearly.
It's something I can identify. I mean, he had an instinct for what was wrong with the person, the actor, what was ailing them. And so you get these brilliant choices like Robert Walker as a killer in Strangers on a Train, where if you know Robert Walker's career, I mean, before that, he was, a young, charming, often played a soldier, likable, all-American kind of guy. But, Hitchcock
same thing with Joseph Cotton.
Great example. Or Gregory Peck. I mean, he not only could find the psychology of them, he knew how to photograph people. I mean, I'm sitting with
brilliantly.
I'm sitting with him in an office, and he out of nowhere starts telling me, well, here's how I would photograph you, and here's why I would do it. It would be with this camera, with this light, your eyes would be like, and I thought, this man is giving me an education. And I know he did that with every actor. I mean, Janet would tell me, and Julie Andrews once said, they got an education because he would tell them, the next time you do a movie, don't let them photograph you with this kind of lens. He cared about that. He cared about photographing Kim Novak as a ghost in Vertigo. Why that eerie green was used all the time, or why the hair color was slightly off, why the costumes, that sort of gray coming out of the San Francisco fog, all of those things, and it was all psychology.
Well, no one in the history of movies thought through their movies more than he did. Even though we have some great directors who, I mean, Kubrick and Spielberg, I think there are some great directors who think very heavily about what they're doing and think their way through the storytelling, both visually and auditorially and so on. But Hitchcock was setting the standard. He was not only great at thinking it through, but he was creating the craft.
Mm-hmm.
And that was astonishing. Was there any material that you wish you had gotten then that you weren't able to get a hold of?
Oh, lots. And that's why I'd love to do, an updated version of, a longer version. So I don't want to show my hand. I would, but I will tell you that I would like to talk a lot more about Mr. H's relationship with Anthony Perkins, because it really was remarkable how he.
That sounds like a whole book in and of itself.
I'd love to write it. Yeah, I mean, and some of it is very mundane and monetary. Like he was so incensed that Anthony Perkins' fellow actors didn't vote for him in sufficient numbers to get him an Academy Award nomination, that Hitchcock, who was really penurious, I mean, very tight man, and he didn't give credit to others easily. Let's put it that way. But he was so incensed by Anthony Perkins' fellow actors. He told me, acting so abominably, and voting for his not voting for him because of his personality or what they perceived, as opposed to what was on the screen. Oh, God, I mean, all those years later, Steve, he was outraged by that. But anyway, he made sure that Anthony Perkins got more money later, and just, he took it out of his own money. Perkins came to him many, many times. He desperately wanted to work with him again. So did Janet Leigh. And I'd really like to talk about those things, because they say something about Hollywood. They say something about Hitchcock. They say things about Hitchcock that I don't think are talked about often enough, particularly in regard to Psycho. And you
want to put that into a book.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I wanted to put it into a movie, but it wasn't the movie that other people wanted to make, sadly. But his relationship with his daughter, which was really particularly interesting during Psycho, is another element, and certainly his relationship with his wife during Psycho, which I did get into the movie. Hitchcock with Anthony Hopkins
and Alma Reville.
Yes. I think she pronounced it Reville.
Was it Reville?
But I always say Reville. Listen, I just recently was corrected, because for years I thought that the screenwriter of Psycho pronounced his name Joseph Stefano. I spent a lot of time.
Stefano, yeah.
He never corrected me, but his wife did. So I'm really grateful for that. And I wanted to bring Joe into the new book far more, because that relationship is a psychodrama. I mean, that's one for the history books.
Wasn't that true for Hitchcock and Lehman as well? That
was different, because Ernie was a very different animal, in that he wore his neuroses, almost like the old lady in her medals. He was really into his neuroses. And although I knew Ernie and we worked together, we were going to write a screenplay together. We were going to write a book together. I knew him for years and years. I felt like with Joseph Stefano, I felt like I knew him better in 2 sessions than I did knowing Ernie for years. I mean, Ernie was really an enigmatic gentleman.
So I've had as a guest on this show John Crampner, who's written a book about Ernest Lehman.
Yeah, I'm in that book. John's really done, I think, beautiful work.
It's a great book. I did read it. I don't recall. You must have been not in a giant section of it, right?
I haven't read it, so I don't know. He
Ah.
tells me I'm in it, but maybe I'm cut. I don't know, but I spoke about Ernie a great deal. But in any case, yeah, that relationship was very hide and seek. The Lehman Hitchcock relationship, where with Mr. Stefano, he was really undergoing intense psychotherapy, and that became part of their sessions, their story sessions, because Hitchcock was always interested. He was certainly interested in my kinks and trying to get at them, but he was definitely interested in Mr. Stefano's kinks. And Joseph was a very open, interesting guy. And anyway, so there are whole other stories to tell about Psycho that aren't just window dressing. They feed into what
Well,
that
it seems it would be a natural for you to write a sequel to your book and have it be a furtherance of whatever it is you were trying to say. I do want to cover some of your other work too. I want to talk about real art for a moment. Explain to the listeners what real art, great posters from the golden age of the silver screen. I mean, it's obviously about posters, but what is it you're covering in the book?
Well, real art is really a look at particularly Hollywood sort of myth making as typified by movie posters. How each, and it's all really pre-1950, but how each movie studio developed a signature poster style, how really interesting illustrators like Hirschfeld and Hap Hadley and Leyendecker and Norman Rockwell all did movie posters, and many, many more. And I'm particularly proud of that book because it was the first time anyone had done a book where someone dug into who were the illustrators, who were the men and women who, were the art directors, were the illustrators, were the people who sort of conceptualized what, how do we sell Marlene Dietrich? How do we make Garbo look like Garbo?
Because they're not just art; they are in fact a marketing tool.
Oh yeah,
you're selling a movie with that particular piece of art. So it's not designed to just be beautiful art that goes into a museum somewhere. It's designed to sell a movie.
And it was designed to sell tickets to people who weren't being bombarded by, the internet or many magazines about the making of movies. They were meant to attract passersby who would look in the lobby, as I did as a kid, actually, look in the lobby and go, "Oh, House on Haunted Hill, what's that?" The idea was always don't smell it, sell it. So the art directors and the illustrators were always about what gets people in, what's the thing that grabs the eye and sells the ticket. It didn't matter. All the time you hear people say, well, that actress didn't wear that dress in the movie, or why are they wearing contemporary clothes when it's a period movie? Didn't matter. They were selling tickets. They were selling dreams. They were selling movie stars. And
so would you say that posters have fallen away as an important sales tool, or are they still as important today?
Oh, they're nowhere near as important, and they're nowhere near as impactful. I mean, showing a picture of a movie star, if such a thing exists anymore, showing a movie of who's in the movie, showing a photo of who's in the movie, as if it's going to sell tickets or draw viewers to Netflix or on Amazon. It's just a lost art. In those days, in the days of real art, in the book that I wrote, it was about stone lithograph and beautiful colors and lies, basically telling lies.
The last great poster artist that I'm aware of, though I'm sure there are others, and I'll get beaten up by people saying, why didn't you mention so-and-so? But the last one that I know of that's still sort of out there is Drew Struzan.
Absolutely.
Who's made some of the greatest posters ever.
Well, and again, careers are often a matter of timing. I mean, he got Spielberg, he got
Lucas.
You got the days of Lucas and the new Hollywood, but he's also beautifully rooted in the past. He knows real art really well, and he knows all those old posters. But he knows how to do it.
Right.
He knows how to sell the dream as opposed to the documentary.
Exactly. All right, but let's talk for a moment about your making of books. How many of those have you done now?
Well, some people say making of Psycho. So, I did 3 books, 3 of those books for Disney on the animated films.
Right.
And that's when I began, working with Disney on some films as opposed to book films or film books.
I assume that those are with Disney in mind, works for hire.
They are, yes.
You're not just coming to them with a speculative idea. They're actually coming to you and say, we'd like you to write X,
Yeah.
Y, or Z.
Yeah, those 3, the first one was yes, but people had recommended me because of the Hitchcock book and some magazine stories I had done making of kinds of things. I thought I'd be good at it, and I turned out to really enjoy it and make a lot of wonderful and lasting connections with the
And are those deep research projects?
More than one would think, but they're more. I think more than research, but more getting into the minds and the hearts and the psyches and the ambitions of aspirations of the movie makers and the dreams that they were trying to capture in animated form, and how the dream is often quite different from the way the movie actually turns out. But those are really interesting to do. And I think because I've earned the right that if I do the next one, there'll be much more latitude in terms of what that book is going to look and feel like, as opposed to the kind of work for hire.
Are they very good at opening their archives to you? Do they allow you?
Yes.
They give you sort of free range on what you can put into the book? I'm talking about pictures and so on.
I can tell them what I like and what I think should be in there, but there's an overarching vision that I think is the studios of the movie that they want to present.
Mm-hmm. Because those books too, correct me if I'm wrong, are a sales tool for the movies as well.
Oh, sure. Yeah. But sure. Yeah. It's different. It's not the kind of book where you're looking at Bonfire of the Vanities and you're saying, gosh, how did that happen? Or you're looking at something like Valley of the Dolls and what were they thinking?
Right.
So no, so they're more they're not postmortems and they're not gotcha books. They're
positive looks at the experience that they had.
Yeah, but I think that they've gotten much better and more open with letting artists talk about their frustrations and their the difference between how they saw and what they were able to achieve. So I like that aspect of that. I think that's healthier. But yes, yes, indeed. The people who love Disney and love Disney and they want keepsakes of those books,
right?
Those movies in book form. When I was a kid, there was a wonderful book called The Art of Animation, and I must have read and looked at that book a million times, and that was a sales tool essentially for Sleeping Beauty, and I just found that book riveting, and it certainly was in my head along with books about the making of Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz as models of the kinds of books that I thought. Well, Lillian Ross's book picture is, to me, it's you don't get much better than that.
A cut above all the others.
Yeah, because of that talent and the fact that look at who is being accessed here, John Huston and all these people sort of at loose ends and at loggerheads. Honestly, a lot of where you get lightning in the bottle is that something happens on the set that's special. Not every movie needs to be documented. The making of every movie really doesn't need to be documented.
Of course not.
It has to be for me, it has to be a compelling story, or else why do it?
Well, there are in the history of movies, which are thousands of movies, there are really only a tiny number by comparison that are worthy of ongoing conversation.
I agree with you. I think the only flip side of that, or the exception could be if a good writer has a personal story to tell about that movie and how it impacted them, and if they can marry that story to the making of a movie, that to me that's therapy.
Sure.
And it's also compelling reading.
Sure. Well, of course, yes, of course, especially when it's got some kind of really personal angle on it. That
Right.
makes it even more interesting. It's not just a repertorial story. It's actually got some kind of personal edge.
Sure.
I have been speaking to the marvelous writer Stephen Rebello for a little more than an hour, and this has just been just a fantastic conversation. But we're going to wind this down just a bit, and just wondering, you've already told us some fantastic stories, but do you have one or more really oddball, quirky, strange, unique, or maybe just plain funny stories in all of your experiences?
Too many. Because of the Hitchcock and Psycho book, I was invited by NHK in Japan to be on live TV for 1 hour, 5 consecutive nights. It was a very ambitious undertaking in that they had literally built or reconstructed sets from Notorious, from Psycho, from Vertigo.
Really?
This was when, in a different world, when the economy was different and there was lots of money to throw around. So there I was, flown, all expenses paid, to Japan. They were just incredible, gracious, wonderful hosts. And there I was, on the set, and I was going to talk about Notorious, and it was going to be the scene with Ingrid Bergman in the key in her hand, with the beautiful parquet floor and the crane shot, to her hand with the incriminating or the important key in her hand, and it was all there. And as I'm having this conversation with them, speaking as best I could, an entire lighting fixture with a big Klieg light just fell.
Wow.
No one was near it, just fell right toward me. And I made the terrible mistake of saying, well, Mr. Hitchcock loved pranks, and I think he's just played one. You don't do that in a country where ghosts and religion is very, very real. I've never seen people turn, they didn't turn on me, but they were shocked into silence. Another aspect of doing that lovely was I had a little earbud in my ear, or whatever it was called then. And the interpreter's English was about as good as my Japanese.
Right.
Because she was saying things like, I think that Mr. Hitchcock's films has many charms. How about you? And it was a really important thing for me, in that I learned, you're driving the interview. You have to approximate what you think they were saying, and you just have to try to give a coherent answer. Apparently I did well enough, because I would leave the studio every night, and there was this coterie of young girls, and I thought, I thought they were, so I thought someone else was coming out, and I literally turned around. They were there every night, and then they would follow me, and then I learned why. They started yelling at me, Harrison Ford. And I thought, oh, they think I must know Harrison Ford. They thought I was Harrison Ford. I've never looked like Harrison Ford on my very best day, but they thought so. And so literally, they would follow me into restaurants. It was.
Did you sign autographs?
Yes, but in my name, I would never sign.
You should have signed Harrison Ford. It would have made him very happy.
The truth is, I just said I never would, but yes, I did a couple of times.
That's very funny.
Yes.
So, last question for you today, Stephen. You've already given us some very interesting ways to look at the business and how you do what you do, but I'm wondering if you have a solid piece of advice or a tip for those that are starting out in the business to do what you do, to write about Hollywood, write stories about celebrities or people that are good in the business, or maybe somebody that's in a little bit and trying to get to the next level.
Well, I think it's the oldest advice in the world, which was, I wasn't very good at all. In fact, I was pretty terrible until I figured out what my voice was, until I learned that I had a certain way of looking at the world, a certain way of presenting myself that I just wasn't like other people. And when you're, if you, let's say if you want to stick with the celebrity thing, if you're talking to a celebrity, it's not about you, and it never should be about you. Although I see people trying to do that all the time, and it drives me crazy. But when I was doing a lot of that celebrity stuff, my stories would get quoted all the time in Liz Smith's column, or in like the New York press really got me. LA press would not give me the time of day ever, but New York always did, and it was all and it was always, they would comment that no one else is getting people to talk like he is, or to be as frank, or to, or disarming, and Steve, it really is all about the fact that I was a therapist, and the fact that that I had have a certain maybe quirky, offbeat kind of rhythm, or anything. Nothing I'm doing consciously. You can't control that, and people either connect with you or you don't. So I don't know how you get what I got, because, but you out there who are listening, you've got something else that I don't, and that kind of your weirdness, your difference, your way of looking at the world, it's completely unlike mine or Steve's here. That's your treasure. That's your gold. That's who you are. And the more you can bring that out, and and still know that if you're doing a celebrity piece, you're shining light on someone else. If you are doing a screenplay, you cannot be afraid of self-exposure. You're going to be judged anyway. You're going to be judged mercilessly, and you've got to, you've got to develop the skin of a rhino, which
that is for sure. If you don't have a skin of a rhino as a screenwriter, you're doomed.
Paul Schrader said something so interesting to me one time, and I don't mean to name drop, but he's such a smart guy. He said, there is no room in this business for Emily Dickinsons.
Oh, that's true.
He's right. And to conclude, what I've tried to do as a human and as a writer, as an observer, is to keep as much of my Emily Dickinson as possible, without it being an affectation, and without it being a crutch, and without it being a deterrent, because they will come after you. I'm learning that the more fame you get, the higher your profile is, the meaner people can get, and conversely, the nicer people can get.
What do you think causes that? Is it jealousy and then desire to be in your good side at the same time?
The people who are nice are truly nice, and they will turn your head sometimes with when they tell you how something you've written or said has really impacted, has made a difference in their life. Someone tells me all the time that the book on Psycho came out at a very low point in this person's life, and he read it really quickly, and it was a reason to live. I mean, it was that when someone tells you that and they mean it, that matters a great deal.
Mm-hmm.
For the people, I understand what envy can be. I remember when I was doing a TV series, which I hated doing, but anyway, I was forced to do it. And I was, it was a lot of on-camera stuff, and it was, not my room, not my vibe, not my anything, but there would always be people outside the studio gate. And I remember looking at one young man, and he had, I remember thinking it was like when I read Day of the Locust. I've never forgotten it, because all I could see in his eyes was, and maybe this was a projection, but this is what I felt from him as an empath, as an intuitive. How do I get from where I am to where he is? Not in a healthy way.
Right.
So I understand that, and I have empathy for that. honestly, it sounds like a lot of things came easily to me. They really didn't.
No, you've worked a long and hard life to get to where you've gotten.
But
you got lucky in a couple of places, and luck plays an important part in everything. But that you couldn't just luck your way into writing a book about Psycho.
No, and nothing was handed to me. But there are certain life experiences or life situations where you go, well, that was fate. That he had to be at that place at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's really that don't be that person who's outside the gate. Figure a way to get in the gate, and the best way to get past the guardians at the gate is to be unique, be yourself. Not let your freak flag fly, not something like that, but the broken places, the things that hurt in all your work, let them show.
I think that this is very, very wise advice. And, be you. Don't try to be somebody else. I think that's really what you're saying. And let who you are be the thing that attracts others, and not try to be someone else. Be you.
The people have a built-in nose for what's genuine and what's fake.
Sure
really do. And so let them see you.
I think that's really terrific advice. Well, Stephen Rebello, this has been a fantastic hour plus on StoryBeat today, and I really appreciate you spending time giving us a lot of this wonderful backstory of the work that you've done, and some terrific advice along the way. I greatly appreciate you coming to the show and giving us all this information. Thank you so much.
Oh, what a pleasure. Thank you.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden. And may all your stories be unforgettable.